In the past, empires arrived under a single flag, carried forward by the sounds of swords and gunfire. Cities were crushed by artillery, and gnats were redrawn in blood. But in the 20th century, the world witnessed the most silent and insidious form of occupation in history: debt colonialism. Armies were replaced by men in suits, stepping off airplanes with briefcases filled not with weapons, but with hundreds of pages of loan agreements. While headlines promised stability and development, behind closed doors the sovereignty of entire nations was reduced to entries on balance sheets. This was the moment when money ceased to be merely a medium of exchange and became a diplomatic weapon capable of capturing the soul of a nation. Today, we are exposing that dark laboratory where finance transformed into power, operating under the long shadow of the International Monetary Fund. The story of this balance sheet empire reveals how territories that armies could not conquer were instead taken hostage by accounting. Most people believe debt is simply an economic burden. In reality, debt is the architecture of the modern world. When the IMF was founded in 1944 at Bretton Woods, it was marketed as a financial doctor meant to heal the post-war world. Its mission was to stabilize exchange rates and give struggling nations breathing room. But over time, that doctor evolved into something else entirely: a cold debt enforcer whose true task became ensuring that banks in New York and London recovered their money at any cost. The roots of this system stretch further back than most imagine, all the way to the late 19th century. The true ancestors of modern IMF programs can be found in the Ottoman Empire after its default in 1881 and in Egypt during the same period. European creditors appointed their own officials to collect taxes directly. Flags still flew, but the pens that wrote the budgets were now held by foreign hands. History makes one truth unmistakably clear: control a nation's money, and you control its future. By the mid-20th century, this old colonial logic was repackaged into a standardized financial formula. Latin America became its primary testing ground. In the 1970s, Western banks flush with petrodollars aggressively lent to countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. Cheap money created the illusion of a miracle. Roads, dams, and factories rose with foreign credit. But every miracle carries a price. That price arrived in the 1980s when the US Federal Reserve abruptly raised interest rates to historic levels. What had once been manageable debt turned overnight into a death sentence. In 1982, Mexico's declaration that it could no longer service its debt sent shockwaves through the global financial system. The IMF intervened immediately, not to rescue Mexico, but to ensure that money continued flowing upward to creditors. This moment marked the birth of what became known as the Washington Consensus and the era of brutal shock therapy. Sovereignty was no longer eroded by armies, but by spreadsheets. IMF rescue packages came with strict conditions. Governments were ordered to slash public spending, privatize state assets, eliminate food and fuel subsidies, and freeze wages. The cost of these policies went far beyond numbers. In Bolivia in 1985, shock therapy reduced inflation on paper, but it also threw thousands of miners out of work and pushed entire communities into hunger. While textbooks praised the program as a success, for the people living through it, it was a social catastrophe. For Latin America, the 1980s became known as the lost decade. Countries sent billions abroad in interest payments, while income per capita collapsed and poverty exploded. Public speeches praised democracy, but national budgets were being written in offices thousands of miles away by bureaucrats who had never lived in those countries. This was occupation without soldiers. Citizens no longer answer to their own governments, but to international lenders and credit rating agencies. They had become debt subjects. The modern world never escaped this colonial cycle. It merely changed names and locations. What Greece experienced in 2015 was no different from Mexico in the 1980s. Under pressure from the so-called Troika, pensions were cut, public services dismantled, and the population was told there was no alternative. The birthplace of democracy was placed under financial guardianship, sacrificing its citizens to satisfy creditors. The debt had grown so large that it no longer existed to be repaid, but to keep an entire nation trapped in endless restructuring. Debt colonialism exposes an uncomfortable truth. Real sovereignty is not determined at the ballot box, but by who owns a country's debt. When a system turns basic necessities such as energy, food, and finance into tools of control, freedom becomes an illusion. Today, even advanced economies are crushed under the largest debt loads in history. The same trap is closing again, this time on a much larger scale. History does not repeat itself, but it selects its victims with the same mathematical coldness. Never forget this. Invading nations is expensive and noisy. Enslaving them through debt is silent and profitable. If there is one lesson to take from this story, it is this: the system survives by keeping you indebted. True freedom begins the moment you recognize the invisible chains. What is killed by debt colonialism is not merely money. It is a nation's right to determine its own destiny. Markets will always recover. Empires will always invent new credit packages. But once sovereignty is lost to spreadsheets, no army has yet been built that can reclaim it. So ask yourself this: who truly controls the future of nations today? Is political independence meaningful when financial decisions are made elsewhere? And if debt has replaced armies, are we already living inside the next silent occupation? History has answers. I merely show you where to look. And if this deep financial journey has given you a new perspective, like the video and subscribe, because the real story begins the moment you recognize the system you are living inside.